We're going to obviously talk about digital humanities in the classroom. And I always jump at a chance to work with Dr. Rism because she's such a phenomenal scholar and a wonderful teacher and colleague. I've known her for quite a number of years now, believe it or not. It's hard to, I met her when she was a graduate student, so it's hard to say how long it's been, but it's really lovely to work with Rupsi as well. That said, let's get started. I want to first sort of define this idea of digital humanities because it may be an idea you're not familiar with. We have thought about this term for years, as scholars often do, and I think the best thing to say about it is it's a really broad field of scholarly inquiry. And we talk a lot about the creation, use, and analysis of technology, sort of broadly. But for the purposes of this seminar, we really want to think a lot about open access tools for inquiry, open access scholarly materials, and materials that can be used in pedagogy and in the classroom. So what I find really exciting about the way digital humanities can interface with K through 12 is that there's a lot of great free material out there that you all can grab and use, because I know, especially if you're a new teacher or you've done this for a long time, perhaps you want some new stuff in the classroom and you want someone to kind of help you prepare lesson plans and sort of get a head start on what you're going to do in the classroom. And I think you'll find that a lot of the materials we present today will be sort of ready, drop and play in the classroom. These slides will be available, so you don't have to write anything down. All the links are active, so you can go back to them and just grab what you need. And then hopefully this will give you a head start in thinking about how to put these materials in your classroom. I guess the question is, why do people want this material in the classroom? Why might you use it? Why is Humanities Texas doing this workshop? Well, I think the best thing is it's free. We know the schools are always under budgeted, and it's hard to get sometimes the materials you need, the lesson plans you need, but this is a lot of drop and play stuff, right? And it's very cutting edge. Scholars are developing this material for you to use. Your students are going to really benefit from it. These digital approaches really engage students, and they allow students to sort of hook into things that may be more familiar to them than, how are we doing a poetry analysis, or how are we going to go and look at primary sources like the Constitution? When you use these digital techniques and approaches, it sort of gives them a lens through which they can work. The other thing we're very aware of as we put this program together is that the schools you're in have varying costs and expertise built in, right? So my daughter's school, Bryan ISD, there was no money. Like, she used to always joke, like, maybe we'll have a field trip once every 3 years, whereas College Station gets to go on a field trip every 3 months, right? So I recognize that sometimes schools don't have a lot of funding to do this kind of work. So we particularly looked for materials that were free to be able to put right into your classroom. We also know that some of you are very experienced with digital materials and some of you are novices. So we're trying to sort of give you a stair-stepped approach. And we kind of say, this you can do if you don't have much experience and all you have is a teacher overhead, right? Like a computer and an overhead. This one you can do if your students have handheld devices or tablets, right? So we're trying to show you how you can pick and choose what we're presenting to drop into your classroom. So I just wanted you to be aware that we're not going to say, and now everybody has to have computers in every hand in the classroom or you can't do this work. No, we recognize that's not realistic for a lot of you. Okay, so I'm going to give you sort of some general overview sources that you can go back to and grab from. Then I'm going to walk you through some specific open access materials that you can use as teacher only, kind of with a projector materials. And then we'll talk about a little more sophisticated usages of tools in the classroom. This is sort of my scope today. Tomorrow, Rupsi will be doing some really cool mapping and timeline things that are a little more sophisticated. So I'm kind of starting at the beginning and we'll gear up through tomorrow. The first thing I wanted to show you are some useful sources where you can go to look for materials that you can kind of drop and play into your classroom. So I'm going to give you examples today, but you might be like, well, that example that's the only one that I can see in my classroom. I really need X, Y, and Z. These sources can get you started in finding the materials you want. Reviews in Digital Humanities, Curriculum and Pedagogy, that's a really good place to start. It's co-edited by Dr. Rism, and there's a lot of great materials there. You're going to find lots of sources you can pull into your classroom. So take a look at those as needed. And remember, these are free resources that we're going to provide to you and point you to. And this allows you to add digital content and tools to your classroom, right? And a lot of these are going to be added with only a teacher computer projector. So low cost, low expertise. All right, so I'm going to sort of pepper in the TEKS as we go through here, so you can sort of think about the TEKS requirements and how they will play and support these materials we're giving you. Because I think a lot of times you're given these materials and you're like, well, I don't know if they really fulfill my TEKS requirements, but they do. And I want to show you how as we go through here. One of the things to think about for those of you that are social studies, history teachers, is a lot of the TEKS ask you to use primary materials, right? That's a sort of cornerstone of the way TEKS are written. I'm going to give you lots of primary materials that you can utilize in your classroom, and that will really sort of enhance the materials you've already been given. For those of you that are looking at sort of general humanities types of materials, there's some great primary sources to get started. Some of these are more sort of general sources, and some of them will have lesson plans built in. The one I wanted to point to specifically was Edsight. I think this is a really great NEH program that helps you to sort of get started on lesson plans and gives you lots of things you can drop into your classroom. And you can see some of this is history and civics, some of this is American history and culture, and they're teacher guides that really allow you to sort of think about things like, you know, historic and cultural sites, including in your teaching. What role should governments and civic citizens play? And there's lots of built-in materials here that you can just move to. So be aware that they're out there, and you might do a little exploration of this on your own. The other thing that's out there that's really helpful, I think, and I teach a Texas Lit class, so I'm well aware of how much Texas history and Texas Lit we like to incorporate into our classrooms. There's tons of Texas-focused digital materials out there that you can get your students engaged with. I often use the Handbook of Texas. It has lots of great overviews of almost any kind of Texas-based materials. Texas History for Teachers is great. I've become pretty enamored with the Art of Publica Press, which comes out of University of Houston. If you're doing any Hispanic studies, Latinx kind of stuff, they're really great. So here's a list of all kinds of Texas-focused digital materials to turn to, okay? The final thing, I'm giving you this sort of links-based material, and then we're going to move into actual examples. The final thing I want to point to are OER textbooks, and this is something a lot of people aren't aware of. OER textbooks are open access, meaning they're free. And they're developed by lots of different entities, but I want to highlight one in particular that's come out of Texas A&M. OER textbooks are something that we've been working with here at Texas A&M within the last 5 years, I'd say. And the idea is that for a lot of students, textbook budgets when you come to college are really, really expensive. And a lot of times what we see is our students, they can pay for the classes, right? They put students loans together to pay for the classes. But when it comes to their textbook purchases, often they don't buy textbooks because they're so expensive. So what we said is, what happens if we can develop a free textbook that they don't have to pay when they take, say, freshman comp? So there's two here I've included on Pressbooks. This first link I wanted to point to. This is the OER book that we have developed to support our freshman comp program. It is free, it is out there, it is for your use. So if you're teaching English, especially something like English that's in an AP structure, and you're thinking about, I want to give my students the same experience that they would have if they went to Texas A&M and took freshman comp, we're giving you the textbook for free. You can go in there and use as many materials out of here as possible. You can assign this to your students and you can see exactly the skills that we're teaching our students. So be aware of these types of materials because they're really a great resource for you. All right, let's pop back here. Okay, here's all these cool links that you can use. And now I'm going to talk about specific assignment ideas. And I'm looking at my time because I want to stay on track so we have time for questions at the end. These first materials are going to be ones that you can use with just a computer and a projector. You can have students break out and do these types of investigations with digital materials. But I know a lot of you are like, okay, all I have is a computer and a projector. What can I do? Here are some ideas. Okay, let's start with the TEKS for English, for those of you that are teaching English classes. One of the things I like about the way the TEKS is written for English is it specifically says you can use print or digital resources to clarify and validate the understanding of multiple meanings of advanced vocabularies. You can use these materials to draw conclusions and talk about nuanced ideas such as imagery, right? So they're sort of opening it up for your use in thinking about how digital can come into your classroom. So here's one example that I use in my classroom that I think works really well. I'm teaching Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman, for example, in my survey of American literature class. And we're talking about Leaves of Grass, and I've had students read the poems in their anthology. So what I always do when we start this class is I say, you know, you're looking at this poem in a certain way it's in an anthology. It's been sort of structured in a certain way. Let's go back and use this free Walt Whitman archive. We're going to look at the actual book itself. We're going to look at the physical object. So what I do is I go to the Walt Whitman archive, which is a very deep archive, well-developed archive. And under published works, we have books by Whitman. And what's really cool is they give you every single edition of the Leaves of Grass. I like to use the 1855. And this is not, you know, what I do is start with this, not a very complicated thing, but I say, let's look at the book cover of the first edition of Leaves of Grass. What do you see? And what's really cool is they're like, oh, that's really pretty. Oh, look, if you look at the words itself, there's like little roots coming down and there's all these flowers. And they start thinking about how the actual book cover itself relates to what they're reading in the poetry. And they start to say, oh, he's using all this imagery of roots and leaves and grass to talk about American democracy. And so this becomes a very easy jumping off point to get to the more difficult work of investigating the poetry, because a lot of our students are going to be much more comfortable looking at this and analyzing this than they are going to be analyzing poetry, right? So it allows you to get a hook into it. And there's lots of these archives out there. So when I teach Dickinson, this is another technique I use, because a lot of the Dickinson's archives, the Emily Dickinson archives, show her original poems. And they're really quite interesting because they're not the structure you see in your textbook. She writes them on backs of her her recipes, or she writes them on envelopes, or the ones my students always like is she takes a chocolate wrapper and opens it and writes a poem on it. So we talk about, like, let's think about the original structure that you see in her handwritten poems versus what you're given in your anthology. So these are very productive ways to kind of get them thinking and almost playing with the idea of poetry in a way that is often not afforded within a textbook. Okay, let's talk about another example. And this is for history people, but also can apply to folks that are teaching English. The TEKS in history is really interested in primary and secondary sources that include maps, scraps, speeches, political documents, these kinds of things. And I want to play with the idea of maps, which Ripsy will come back to tomorrow and do a deep dive into. But in thinking about maps, I always teach Cabeza de Vaca in my survey of American literature, as well as Texas literature. And for those of you that don't know de Vaca, he is a Spanish explorer who's one of the first to sort of come to Texas, and he becomes lost in a shipwreck in Galveston and sort of wanders Texas for like 7 years. And when he sort of finds other Spanish conquistadors, he gets back with them, goes home, and he writes this sort of expose on his travels through Texas. What will now, you know, not then Texas, but now Texas. And so what's really cool about this is that Texas State has put up the original volume as a digital artifact. So your students can look at the actual 1555 edition. And what's in that edition is this beautiful image. And what I can often start students thinking about is, what does this image mean, right? How does this image suggest the idea of conquest and colonialism? What does it say about de Vaca's sort of merging back into sort of the Spanish hierarchy? So we start with that, and we think about this sort of, images we see and what the book actually sort of suggests about Devaka. The other thing I often use is, and again, this goes to these ideas of maps, graphs, and charts in the TEKS. We can look at what scholars believe to be the routes that Devaka takes through Texas. And the Texas State has a really nice set of materials to help you do this. So if you look at this material here under the route, you'll see that, we learn about how historians think about what route Devaka took through Texas and how do they, from his volume, start to piece out what this might look like. And so you can have your students look at these documents and read actual historians and how they're thinking about, well, where is he going? How do I know he's going in these places? And of course, my students get really excited about this because they're like, it's Texas. We hardly ever talk about, what it means to me in my locality. We're talking about New England. I don't know what to do with that. But here I know what to do with Texas. I understand where he's moving to. So that's another suggestion with just how you can use these available materials and get your class thinking about these things broadly. The final sort of piece I want you to think about before we talk about tools is the way that we might think about arts broadly writ, right? Both for history and English, we're given the opportunity in TEKS to think about the various genres of art, music, film, and literature. So for those of us who've taught poetry, we know how difficult it is to get students to think about poetry itself. They're great with music lyrics, right? They know what to do with that, but poetry feels like sort of a foreign form for them. So what I do, and again, the TEKS English has this as well, the multiple genres, listening, speaking, reading, writing, right? So what I often do is say, all right, let's think about song in relationship to poetry. So one mechanism to do this is to look at corridos. And for those of you that are not familiar with corridos, they're a sort of folk music construction, very familiar to Texas, right? And often used as storytelling and a historical record. So I often have my students think about past corridos and contemporary corridos. Like there was a really funny corrido written for the last election on Bernie Sanders. And so I have students like think about what does it mean that something historically could be about Gregorio Cortez, and what does it contemporarily mean to think about this as a political means of storytelling, right? And these open access materials are really great because if you look here, they actually give you learning lesson components and learning objectives. So if you're like, okay, I can see why you would take a story and or a song and use that as a way to think about structure of lyrics, rhyme scheme, all these kinds of things we want to talk about poetry. But how do I actually do that? These are really great. These materials are really great at helping you think through that and developing materials out of this for your classroom. So this one comes out of Smithsonian. There's other great materials. So for example, the Library of Congress has really wonderful materials to help you as teachers. They have primary sources, so you can have them listen to materials, listen to corridos. You can have them listen to clips of, say, the poet laureate talking about corridos. And so lots of great opportunities here to form beginning projects where they think about these corridos as structures that have sort of similar structures as poetry, right? History classes might look at things like the corrido of Gregorio Cortez, which is one that's been told and retold over time. And it's really interesting to think about it in terms of nationhood, cross-border conflict, the borderlands of Texas. You can talk about the way these corridos shift over time. And so lots of possibilities there to get your students thinking about poetry as something that's living in a way that perhaps they don't when they just read a Shakespeare sonnet, right? All right, so that was my fast kind of overview of some ways that you can take these digital objects and drop them into your classroom. Let's think about something that's a little more robust, perhaps. So I'm gonna end with talking about some ways that I use actual tools in the classroom. And again, if you have a classroom where you just have the projector and overhead, this might be fine for these projects. You just might walk them through as a class using this tool. But if you have students who have handheld devices, like I know a lot of the students in my daughter's classroom would have a phone, like a smartphone of some sort. They may not have a computer at home, but they might have a smartphone. The tool I'm going to talk about works fine on their smartphones. They don't need a tablet. They can just pull their phones out. And I know it's weird to think, I usually tell my students to put their phones away, and now you're telling me get the phone out, right? Like this is a different thing, but it can actually be really helpful. And if not everyone has a phone, you can put them in groups where one person has a phone and they can play with this as well, okay? So the tool I want to talk to you about is Voyant. And this is a really interesting tool that I have used for quite a while in my classrooms. And it does pretty sophisticated kind of analysis of text, but it's super easy to use, which is always to me the best kind of tool, right? Like it's drop and play. This is the link to it, and I'm going to show you some examples of Voyant in the flesh, okay? So I'm going to start off by showing you two different ways that you can use Voyant to analyze those primary texts that they ask you to use. So I'm going to do one analysis with the Constitution. So for you social studies folks, you know, you are told by your teaks that you're supposed to look at these primary sources. And we know what students do when you give them like the Constitution, they kind of glaze over a bit, right? So how can you make that more interactive to them to really sort of dig in and think about how the structure of this Constitution is written? What are some of the themes and ideas you need to get out of it? The other thing I want to talk to you about is the use of a primary text like Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And credit to Rupsi on this one. She sort of said, oh, I love this. I love teaching this text using Voyant. It works really well. So those are the two things I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to shoo my cats away because I've decided now is the time to get into a sparring match over here, of course. So here's the first thing I want to talk to you about. How do we use this tool to talk about the Constitution? So I'm going to drop out here. This is always a scary point in presentations where you're like, oh no, I'm going to actually do a live demo. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so hopefully you can see Voyant. Voyant, the tool itself, it's really simple. You've got this text box here. You can either drop in links to a web page, or you can just cut and paste a text into there. So obviously you'll need some sort of digital text to work with, but in the case of the Constitution, this is easy. I can go find it anywhere. Just so you know, there are some already built-in materials here. I'm just gonna show you what they are. There's two corpus. You can pull in all of Shakespeare plays. So if you're an English teacher, and you're like, oh, I always have to teach Midsummer Night's Dreams to my student. They already have all his plays in there you can grab and work with. If you teach Jane Austen's novels, they're built in there as well. But what's really good about this is you can just cut and paste text. So let me go over here. I have found a text. Just a sort of thing to think about as you're working with these materials. I'm gonna cut and paste all this. Come on. This is where okay, so we've got a text from the US Constitution. The only warning I would say about this is, as you all know, some websites are better than others. So as you're working with materials, just make sure you've picked a decent website, you know, that's gonna give you a high quality text. This I got from the senate.gov. So pretty good source. So I'm cutting and pasting that. I'm gonna dump it right into this box. And then we hit reveal, and it does its little algorithmic things in the background. And so what you see now is that text, and it's dumped it into this tool, and it's giving you lots of different ways to think about this text through analysis of numbers of words, where the words are in the document, and you can play with this. So for example, you have a word cloud, right? And what I always say to students is, look at the word cloud. We're talking about the Constitution. What are the most used words in the Constitution? And they're like, wow, shall. Why is it shall? What does that mean? And this is something they probably wouldn't pick up if you just had them analyze the text itself. And you might tell them, you know, why is it shall? You shall, you shall. What does that say about the way that the Constitution is constructed, and what it sort of thinks, what we might think about what it is designed to do, okay? We have that. We also have this kind of cool bar over here where you can see how often these words are used across the text. So here's the beginning of the text and here's the end of the text. So first lines of the Constitution, end lines of the Constitution. And I often say, what is it that shall starts, at a high point at the beginning, and by the end, it's sort of becoming less used. What does it mean by the end of the Constitution? We see the most use of president as a term. So it really gets students a chance to sort of think about these documents in a different way. You can see here that it also, if you think about context, what terms surround the idea of shall, okay? And so you can kind of deep dive there. I also like to always tell my students, look at the readability index. What does it mean that something is more or less readable, right? Who is a constitution designed to be read by and used by? So that gives you a sense of one way that we can use these tools. I want to jump also to the, let me pull up my next document, to the Douglass text. So Frederick Douglass's "What's the Slave" is the 4th of July. I'm going to cut and paste that one in, and it's very short. It's a short little text, short little speech. But we can do some really cool stuff in Voyant. Okay, so I've dropped it in here, and we might start in my class by talking about some of the themes and ideas in it, but then we drop it into Voyant and we talk about, well, what things do you see by using this tool that you may not have otherwise? And what Rupsi always tells me about this project, and I love this, she said the students will talk all about sort of ideas of liberty and citizenship, but when they drop it into Voyant, they go, oh, look, there's a lot of ideas about religion and Christianity that we didn't really think about when we read the text itself. So they're actually more often used than what we thought they were. What does that do to the way we think about the text? What kinds of ideas are there that we might have missed the first read? Okay, so these are really great ways to get your students to engage with new ways of looking at the materials. And again, you could have them do this in the front of the class, right? If you only have a projector, you put it up there, you let them look through it, or you can put them in small groups and have them pick different pieces of the text to look at. You can have them pick different text. You can take this assignment and make it an individual assignment where they each have a text and then do some writing about it. There's lots of ways to move through this as a project itself. Okay, so that's using Voyant as a way to help them analyze a text. The other thing I do with Voyant that I just love, and I've had my graduate students do this with their freshman comp and tech writing students as well. It's a pretty powerful exercise. I love to have them look at their own writing using Voyant. So let me pull this essay up. This is something I just grabbed offline. This is an example from AP English. So if you're teaching an AP history or English class, you have them write sample essays. Sometimes what I have them do is I say, okay, you wrote a draft of your freshman comp paper, grab that material, grab your text, throw it in here, and let's see what Voyant tells us about our writing. So let's do a reveal on the AP English class. Now, one thing to know about Voyant that's really important is it defaults to removing stop words. And I want to point this out because it's really important as we talk about this as a revision tool. So stop words are sort of commonly used words like is, and, they, the, right? So it automatically filters those out. There's a way to add them back in. So let me show you the two ways to use both no stop words and stop words in revision, okay? So this person is writing a AP essay on Kennedy, right? And what this person can then say is, okay, are there words I overuse, right? Because you know how you'll get a student essay and you're reading, you're like, okay, that word is overused. You're gonna have to find some different words, right? So this is a way to sort of help them see that visually, right? What does it mean that you're using these words consistently? The other thing to have them look at is, these contexts down here of how they're using words. You can have them look at phrases, right? These are phrases they often use. Are they overusing certain phrases? So here's terms, right? We can look at it just in the word cloud, but we can also use it in terms. Look at terms. What does this mean? The other really cool thing, and I love this, What about the way you're using the connections of words? So what does it mean that when we use man, it connects primarily to these words? What does it mean in our writing then we choose country? We're connecting it to these words, okay? So this is a good way to sort of have them think about, you know, some of the ways their writing is being constructed in ways that they may not in revision, right? The other thing I was saying about stop words, if we turn stop words off, there's this little button here you can use, and it'll pop up a stop words thing, and you can say, no, I don't want stop words. Let's see what happens. When you take stop words out, it'll reconfigure, and they start to see what words they're using a lot of, right? Of course, they're using ands and thes a lot, but is there something that's popping up there that you're like, really, you need to not use was? I don't want you to use past tense, right? I want you to use present tense. Well, you can see that. You say, you've used was 11 times. Are you sure you want to be using that, right? So this is a way to help them look at their writing in a way that's really hard for students to do, right? We know that students struggle with knowing what revision looks like, right? My students are always like, look, I changed 3 words, it's revised. And you're like, no, 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 no. Let's talk a little bit more about what revision actually means. So I hope that those examples sort of give you a way to think about these more complex tools and how they might be useful. And again, you know, Voyant is just drop in, see what you get out of it, play with it. And just so you know, for those of you that think this is really cool, Voyant also includes a list of other tools that can be used that work outside of this sort of Voyant dashboard. So I have students in the past who wanted to do some analysis of, say, Twitter. If you look at the Voyant tools list, there are some really cool like drop and play analysis pieces, analysis tools for things like Twitter. So there's lots of places to go with this, but basically this gives you a starting point, right? And my sense of using digital materials in the classroom is start with the easy stuff, right? Maybe show like some primary sources and use them, like incorporating maps into your classroom, or, you know, we're going to look at the leaves of grass front piece, right? We're going to look at the book. Start there and build in a little more over time. So you sort of stair step these things. Nobody expects you to go back to your classroom and dump all these things in at once, right? Pick the things you feel comfortable with and add over time. There's lots of options out there. And let's see where you go with them. Because again, I think students, because of the way that they think and read, and they're very visual and very technology focused, and they pull materials and ideas in small bites, this is a way to make a bridge between the kinds of stuff they're doing on their, you know, Snapchat and the kinds of things you want them to do with the text in the classroom. So think about it as a sort of transition to the kinds of ideas and thoughts and writing and thinking you want them to do. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of things at you. These are all available on the slideshow. You're going to have access to those materials, so don't worry about that. But what I want to do, I'll answer questions, and then I think we have about 15 minutes for questions.